and then I'm going to share the screen. Well, let me first tell you what we're doing. So because it's behavioral neuroscience, last week I did the pineal gland. So that related to the sixth chakra. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the pituitary gland that is considered the master gland. And I'm going to tie it in, of course, to the biology of the brain. I'm going to bring it into the body related to the stress response, the adrenals that release cortisol when we're in a fight, flight, or freeze response. And then I'm going to tie it in to mythology, symbology, and then I'm going to bring in the archetype of the wounded child, because everybody has a wounded child archetype. I call it the inner child, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. I'll tie it into astrology, so those of you who want to check your chart can check your chart. And then I'm going to bring in, I don't know if you guys remember, but in campus, I have these archetype cards. If you want on Tuesday, you can look at them, but I've used them before. I have a picture of one of them. They're from Carolyn Mace's project of archetypes. And there is a child archetype or a wounded child archetype. I'll talk to you about her philosophy, and then I'll tie it in to some astrology. And then you can, if you want to check your chart, you can look by sign and by house what archetype of the wounded child you're living and how you fight, flight, or freeze in your chart. And then come June, I'm going to teach a whole lecture on just Chiron. That's the wounded warrior, as we call him. So those are my objectives for today. Let me share the PowerPoint. Can you guys see that? So today we're going to talk about the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is known as the master gland. So we talked about the pineal on Tuesday, and today we're going to talk about the pituitary. The pineal was linked to the sixth chakra, and everything I talked to you about, east meets west, this idea of unity of mind, body, spirit, saying, being, talking, thinking, all one. So now we're going to talk about the transcendence. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the seventh chakra. So course objectives, discuss the biology of the pituitary gland. We're in behavioral neuroscience. Of course, some universal laws in the Hermetic tradition linked to hypothalamus. That's actually what dictates the pituitary. It's the hypothalamus that tells the pituitary what hormones to release. Some mythology around the pituitary gland, some symbology. Then I'm going to link it to Chiron, your fight, flight, and freeze response, and of course subconscious trauma that started at the moment of conception all the way to 0 to 7 when you got your story. And then some inner child concepts, and of course applications for practice. So a little bit about the biology of the pituitary. The pituitary is also known as the hypophysis, and the hypophysis is a pea-sized endocrine gland at the base of your brain. It's behind the bridge of your nose and directly below your hypothalamus. And like I said, your hypothalamus actually directs your pituitary to let it know what hormones it needs to release, specifically in a stressful situation. If you see here, it looks like a little crevice, and it's seated in that curvature. And that's called the sella turcica or the silla turca. That's actually where I get this idea of the dethroning your parents. It's like a throne. Obviously, there's a symbology to the throne, the kingdom, as I've shared before, but actually the biology of it, the anatomical structure, also dictates that it's a throne, and that in order to reach higher consciousness and to come full circle in life, we have to dethrone our parents. Hypophysis is a word that means lying under. So it's under the conscious mind, and I will link that to the subconscious today. The pituitary is referred to the master gland, and I will talk about the word master It secretes hormones and it tells other glands to produce hormones. God, Jesus per se, has been called the master by his disciples. Your parents are your master from the subconscious. And at conception, whatever trauma, quote unquote, occurred, again, it doesn't have to be trauma like somebody who was abused or raped or abandoned. It's trauma in the sense of incarnation. And if you remember back to that grief video that I shared with you, the grief cycle begins when we're, quote unquote, thrown out of heaven or thrown out of Olympus, leave the cosmic consciousness or the universal womb to incarnate in the body. It's the limitation of the body that is the trauma. And then that starts at conception, and by 7, we have the story. The Greek word for master is Kyrios, and I'm going to talk about the opportune time, the return home, Chiron, and the primordial wound. I will link that into astrology, into mythology, and this idea of opportune time, of when it's appropriate to dethrone our parents and assume the throne. So here's a picture, and it starts with the stress response. So we obviously have a physiological and a physical stress response. When the body identifies stressful situation, the hypothalamus indicates to the pituitary that something has to happen. And the adrenals that sit right above the kidneys, and this is going to be important in a minute for the fight, flight, freeze response, the adrenals are told to release cortisol. And the cortisol indicates if we're going into the fight, flight, or freeze. The fight and flight response is actually a sympathetic nervous system response, where we get out of rest and digest, and all of the energy goes to our extremities, and it's that quintessential, there's a lion chasing you or a bear and you have to run. The freeze response is actually a parasympathetic nervous system that I call sheep syndrome, where we actually freeze and we don't do anything. We're, quote unquote, anticipating our next move. At the psychological, mythological, and astrological level, these are related to Chiron, the wounded child, abandonment, again, abandonment when we're, quote unquote, kicked out of the cosmic consciousness and forced into a limited body in the womb. And of course, the story around our wound, our subconscious wound that started at conception through 0 to 7. So cortisol is released by the adrenal glands. The adrenals are sitting right above the kidney. So kidneys are associated in traditional Chinese medicine with fear. One of the things I see in my practice when clients come over and they'll be like, oh, I have to go to the bathroom. I can tell that they're already sort of afraid of what might come up in the session, what we might see in the records. So I've identified this as well in my practice. And so here you see the adrenal gland, this yellow, right above the kidney, and it releases cortisol. If you've ever heard of adrenal fatigue, people that maybe drink a lot of coffee or exhausted all the time, that's related to that. And that again is a fear response from psychological stress. So what do we know in research about cortisol? When cortisol is increased in the fight-flight response, we actually have a decrease in cognitive impairment, okay? And a decrease in emotional memory. We can't recall things. We can't think clearly. Increased cortisol is decreased cognitive performance. This is not a moment that we're thinking logically or rationally. We're actually thinking from an emotional standpoint. We can't necessarily recall what is happening, so it's not like we can take control of the emotion and go, oh, this is just a subconscious trauma from 3 years old, and we can't sort of think ourselves out of it. We're in an emotional response. But we don't have a clear mind in order to make good decisions. So it's more of a physiological stress, fight or flight, the lion's chasing, saved my life, very much impulsive sort of situation. We know that increased cortisol flattens circadian rhythm. This means we do not sleep well. Many of us won't sleep well through the night when we're stressed about something. Again, that stress response interferes with our sleep. I told you the other day with the pineal gland, one of the pillars of Ayurveda was sleep, and good sleep, when we have a good peace of mind, when we've sort of behaved properly or what we would think is live truthfully, would not impact the sleep. But when we're stressed and we're sort of connecting to our subconscious trauma, our sleep is absolutely affected. It reduces memory and reduces executive function. The executive function happens in the prefrontal cortex, and that is what I call adulting. That is when we can really think clearly, go from child to adult, and make a good choice. We do not do this when cortisol is being released from the adrenal glands. Cortisol is increased with alcohol intake, and cortisol is reduced with education, animals, and plants. And I'll tie that into Chiron in a bit, because Chiron actually rules our diet. So a good diet will decrease cortisol, just like the alcohol will increase it. And that goes back to the centaur, which is an alcoholic in mythology. And animals is ruled by Chiron, so I'll tie that in a bit. So cortisol is present as a stress response. Stress is the need to survive. So think of those survival needs or safety, security needs. There's a perceived stress. Perceived is important. The stress may or may not be there, but you are linking back to a memory. Remember, it's fear. Fear already happened. So you have a perceived stress that puts you in fight, flight, or freeze. You're linking back to something previous that you have a memory of. You're not able to necessarily access that memory, as I said, but the body recognizes it. When you get into this stress response, it's because it already happened. It's in your subconscious. It's something that happened from the moment of conception to 7 years old. Depression is linked to the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system. The HPA is what we call this when the hypothalamus indicates the pituitary to send to the adrenals so that cortisol is released. This quote citation down here is an article from 2001 that links directly depression to this system. Cushing's syndrome is a syndrome where people develop like body fat around their third chakra, extremities, and it is excess cortisol. And this brings me to sheep syndrome. Sheep syndrome is what I call people that freeze. You're going to see in a moment, Chiron in your chart is linked to certain signs, and the quintessential one is Chiron in Libra. Libras, so Sam, have a tendency to go into what we call sheep syndrome. Think of the sheep. The sheep is being shepherded by the shepherd, and they're in a flock. Well, the sheep, look at it, so cute and innocent, is kind of just like looking off into nowhere land and gets lost from the flock. What happens is he has this idea that a wolf can come and eat him. So he shuts down and he plays dead. So we do this. People that go into freeze response will shut down and they play dead for fear of getting eaten, obviously, metaphorically, by the wolf. This could be directly related to depression, where you sort of shut down any movement. And we know that depression is linked to some sorts of depression are linked to lethargy, being in bed, eating a lot, things like that. So this is directly linked to this concept of sheep syndrome. When I see this in my practice, what I have learned is that this person is holding themselves hostage to something that they made a choice about in their childhood or in their previous life, so to speak. So even if you're 30 or 40 years old, you still haven't been able to move on, and you haven't forgiven yourself for a poor decision that you made in adulthood or young adulthood or childhood. So how do we link this hypothalamus pituitary adrenal and cortisol to universal laws. So I told you on Tuesday that the master law of Hermetic philosophy is all is mind. There is an energy that encompasses everything in the universe. This is what we conceptually think of as God. And all is stored there, excuse me. This is the hypothalamus. This is the indicator of when stress begins, is released as a messenger to activate the pituitary gland. So this is the master law. And from a subconscious perspective, the subconscious controls everything from the moment of conception, according to my philosophy. All other laws of the Kabbalion or the Hermetic philosophy are actually part of all is mind. So law of karma or cause and effect, law of correspondence, law of gender, which I broke down previously into the different chakras or the unmet needs, those are all built in to the all is mind concept. This also refers back to this idea that it was the problem, quote unquote, the stress was when you left the universal consciousness or the universal womb, that's when the stress happened at the moment of conception. In the physical body, we have the adrenals and the cortisol. We see this as depression, emotions, cognition obviously affected, choosing alcohol perhaps as a poor coping, or food, poor food, not sleeping well, human growth hormone, oxytocin, vasopressin are all released as an indicator, hypothalamus letting the pituitary gland to know what hormones to release depending on what the body's trying to achieve. From the subconscious, this physical plane is the subconscious mind, the initial wound at conception through 0 to 7, and this, in fact, determines our fight, flight, freeze response. It's the master key to healing and returning home to your throne, and I will talk about the 0 to 14, the 15 to 52, and then what I'm calling the beyond the 52. But the 48 to 52 is obviously where we master ourselves, and I'll reiterate that. So this symbol here is a symbol of Chiron. I'm going to bring it to the astrology chart in a moment. And the word master means Kyrios in Greek. And this is referred to as opportune time or referred to as Chiron, and I'll tie them in.
Guys, did she disconnect or something?
Yeah, I think she's like talking to the PowerPoint because she wasn't on like the Blackboard page. Does someone want to like hang up and call her? Because I'm using my phone. Is somebody like not on Blackboard on their phone? All right, I think Emmanuel did it. Yeah, Emmanuel's gonna do it. It's all right.
Sam, what the hell's going on?
What do you mean? Did you call her? Bruh,
I don't even think
he
she's
left
connected.
again.
See her. Yeah, she's not in here.
Welcome back.